Welcome into the I-80 Club Plus One. Josh Peterson with you. We appreciate you joining us. If you have discovered us on the I-80 Club YouTube page, we would love to have you become a patron today at patreon.com/I-80 Club. And about once a week or so during the football season, we have been bringing on a guest. And today, one of my radio friends from the Pacific Northwest, from 1080 The Fan. He's also involved with the Oregon football pregame radio coverage. It is Dirt Johnson from Dirt and Sprague. Andy, how are you, man? What's going on?
Doing good, man. Doing good. It's so funny that when the schedule gets released and we all kind of think about these days and the weeks that will be exciting, like, oh, that one will be fun. You kind of circle those days on the calendar. We all do it as fans. And then it's every year it feels like it's a million months away. It's never going to get here. And we got to go through all this nonsense and these garbage opponents. And then finally it's like, hey, look at that. It's here. And now it's like blink of an eye. It's Thursday. Game's going to be over. So it's been a whirlwind week, but we're fired up. We're ready to go.
Yeah, we are. We're excited to watch it. And of course, it is the Nebraska off week. And so that's even better for those of us who just like parking our asses on the couch all day long and watching some football. Though I'll be in Chicago for the marathon, so it's going to be a little bit different. But I know that I'll be watching this one. I'm looking forward to it.
A marathon on this date? Of all the dates you could have picked, October 12th? What are we doing?
Day after. It's the 13th.
Okay.
So I'll be in the hotel.
Okay.
I think right when this game ends, that is when it will be shut eye for me. So that sucks because that means I'm going to miss the Kansas State-Colorado game live.
Yeah.
So I'll wake up and check that out and then move forward with my day. Hey, before we get to this game, you given the area in which you cover and that 4 teams were involved in this realignment, 2 that moved and 2 that stayed. I wonder how your audience is enjoying and not enjoying what the conference realignment has meant for the current iteration. And given your co-host, Brandon Sprague, it's got to be a little wild given that he is a Oregon State Beaver.
It's been a weird year, man, to say the least. You were out in town in, when was that, August? I think we talked about this a little bit. And it's weird because Oregon has never been more excited and optimistic and built up, and it's just energy and a coach who wants to be here. And it's like everything is full steam ahead, never been better. And then on the other side of it, Oregon State's playing Nevada this week on the road on the CBS Sports Network. Oh. And yeah, it's really hard because you try and balance the coverage on the show with 2 teams locally, and we've had Beaver fans complaining this week, and I get it, but I'm like, of all the weeks to complain about a lack of coverage, maybe not the biggest Oregon game ever, and you're playing Nevada. Like they got UNLV next week. Oregon's playing Purdue. It's like, all right, that'll even out. Purdue's terrible. UNLV is actually kind of fun, borderline top 25 team, so it'll ebb and flow a little bit. Them getting their conference stuff settled, I think, has helped a tad, but it's never going to fix it. And it's unfortunate because I feel like it's just affecting our pocket of the country where, Big Ten teams now, you got to come out west. So there's a little more travel involved. You got Texas and Oklahoma in the SEC. Cal and Stanford still makes no sense. And that's the dumbest thing of all time. But it's like, it's really only our pocket of the country that has been affected in terms of everything splitting apart and then schools getting left behind. I was watching a clip of the Stanford Virginia Tech game this weekend, and I want to guess that there was about 27 people in attendance. Oh. And those are the kind of things that just make Oregon State and Washington State fans livid because they care. They're passionate fan bases. They go, they attend. The TV numbers are solid. And then they look down, they're like, they're in that conference because they're in the Bay Area. That's a TV market that you want, even though nobody cares about college football down there, despite what you saw at game day at Cal last weekend. So it's been weird. It's been hard. And we try and balance it the best that we can. But there's a lot of people in this pocket of the country that have become disillusioned by the sport, and they're watching less and less invested that they've ever been. And I don't know if that comes full circle. Maybe they make a playoff someday, but for right now, it's for 2 fan bases, it's great. And for 2 fan bases, they're kind of on the outs.
I imagine that you are like me and that you sometimes will get those emails with like, hey, here's a book. If you want to have a guest on your radio show, check it out. So we got one. I got one for my day job before the year, and I'm actually trying to get one of the guests on the I-80 Club for this new book from Armin Katayan and John Talty called The Price. And I was like, hey, college football book, I'll say yes to a free copy of this. And so I've been reading it over the last couple of weeks, and man, it's fascinating because it's basically about all of the ills, if you will, of college football currently. And one of the things is just all of the realignment stuff. And it's pretty nuts to think that we are only a few years removed from learning that Oklahoma and Texas would leave. And then everything else that has followed. But the chapter that I read last night was about the Pac-12 media rights deal. And man, I mean, that's not that long ago, right? That's last summer. And you're laughing like,
Yeah.
I was like, oh, that's right. They had the numbers, but then they said no, and the Big 12 snuck in front of them, and they thought that they were worth $65 million or something. I'm like, what in the world was going on with this conference and this deal?
It's just stupidity is what it was. There's no reason the conference shouldn't be around anymore. The biggest it's just a West Coast thing where I think we're a little more laissez-faire. We're a little more passive. We're not aggressive. And if this conference would have done to the Big 12 what people did to the then Pac-10, Pac-12, whatever you wanted to call it, after USC and UCLA left, we would still be alive. There were a lot of people that when Oklahoma and Texas left the Big 12 said, now's your time to go strike. Now go get Oklahoma State, go get Texas Tech, go get Kansas State, go get those schools, Iowa State, whoever you want, Baylor, good basketball program, bring them in, make it a 16-team, 18-team conference, and you would essentially be a slightly better version of the Big 12 right now with a title contender in Oregon and really good basketball schools, and you would have been saved. And you're not making Big 10 SEC money, but the conference would have stuck together with the rest of the 10, even with maybe the departure of USC and UCLA. But it was this attitude of just passiveness, man. That was the entire thing. Their big idea 3 years ago was to form an alliance with the ACC and Big Ten, which meant nothing. There were no signatures. There was no agreement. It was a handshake that said, we won't poach each other's schools. And then 6 months later, they took USC and UCLA. I was like, oh, okay, so that didn't work out. It's frustrating, man. Like I'm mixed. Like these weeks are really exciting. We're playing Ohio State. It's a big effing deal. Like we're jacked. This is awesome. Going to Michigan later this year. It's going to be awesome. Like Big Ten championship game, if you can get there, it's going to be sweet. And then there's the weeks in between where it's like Maryland's in town in 2 weeks. Like, I don't care, man. Maryland's not a good team.
Well, you mentioned the Purdue game next Friday. That's going to be weird.
It's just those random ones. Like Michigan State was interesting last week because it was Jonathan Smith being back in town. So you had those storylines. But I'm sure, I just had a kid last year. So maybe when he grows up in Big Ten country now, it'll be different for him when he's like 20. But there is a lot of that of like, man, not playing Washington State or not going down to Arizona where it was always like a trap game late at night and you had those things built in. You lose some of that. And maybe time will heal those wounds. Maybe everybody will eventually rip back. Maybe we'll get a Super League in 5 years. Who knows how it'll work out. But incompetence is how we got here with the Pac-12. The presidents hiring bad commissioners and then not being aggressive. They sat on their hands. To your point, thought they were worth more than they were actually worth. And here we are. 2 teams got left behind and everybody else splintered off to different conferences.
Pretty wild. Hey, you mentioned that you're now in Big Ten country. I remember when Nebraska joined, and I think we're a lot alike, right, in that we watch the teams that we grew up rooting for and cover, but we also love watching the rest of the conference. So I remember when Nebraska suddenly is in the Big Ten, feeling like, all right, well, instead on a Saturday of watching a lot of Big 12 games, I got to start watching a lot of Big 10 games, especially then as I moved into my career. Got to know what's going on with the league. I still watch the Big 12, just not as much as I used to. Yeah. Long windup to ask you, are you doing the same thing? Are you checking out more Big 10 games? And what's that been like for you, given that the conference has a certain attitude about it, I guess?
I will say, like I'm fully a member yet. I feel like that takes a year, so we'll eventually get there. You guys play a lot of bad football, man. Like there's a lot of bad football in this conference, dude. Like, are there any good quarterbacks? Are there any good offenses? And thankfully, you guys have reverted to the 21st century, and you're away from where you were last year. But I'm watching like Minnesota. They're all, like they can run the ball, but dear God, man, Cade McNamara might be the worst quarterback I've ever seen in my life. That guy sucks. Michigan can't complete a forward pass. We just played Michigan State. They suck. Like Wisconsin's offense is terrible. I'm watching it. It's not the same though. It's just not, as you mentioned, when you will watch Big 12 games back in the day, like we're staying up for a Pac-12 after dark game and the ramifications of Washington State doing something stupid against UCLA or whatever it was at 11 o'clock Pacific, like losing that, it hurts a little bit. So I'm keeping an eye on, games that I know Oregon's going to, if there's an opponent on the schedule, I'll watch, or, hey, we got them in 2 weeks. Let's keep an eye on them. But to the level that we watch the Pac-12 and talked about it week in and week out, hasn't got there yet. Maybe it will. In a year or two, it'll become a little more normal. But for now, be a happy individual because that's another offense that's just terrible.
Hey, what do you think about the time zone stuff? I've been quoting it a lot on my radio show and on the pod this week. 1 in 8 right now for schools that are traveling 2 or more time zones. Is that just sample size? Is there something to it?
I think we talked about it this week too. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle right now. I feel like there's no doubt in my mind that later in the year, I think this is going to be something to keep an eye on. Like Oregon in November has a 3-week stretch where they go to Michigan early November, like November 2nd, and then they go to Wisconsin 2 weeks after that. Like those are the ones that I circled like late in the year, cold weather, back, 2 and 3 weeks. That's like we've all flown. That sucks. You kind of get that kind of hangover and you don't quite have the body clock set up. Like that's definitely a real thing. I feel like in the short term, though, all of those games make sense to me. Like the only win for a team, I believe, is Indiana at UCLA. I don't know if you guys got UCLA this year. They suck. UCLA is terrible.
It sucks, though. They're coming to Lincoln. It's like, and then USC, Nebraska has to travel. It's like, I would love the time zone thing to flip around, and maybe you could get USC off the body clock.
Maybe we get that win, man. I know, because USC is a prime. They went to Michigan. They can't win. They went to Minnesota. They can't win. I wouldn't be shocked if they win this weekend because I don't really buy Penn State that much. But I think there's a medium right now where I'm at. I think a lot of these games, the team that has won has made sense to me, so I'm not going to make a huge deal out of it. But one of those that I'm just like filing away for like late October, early November, mid-November, is this still a thing where a team that you look at of, man, they were a 13-point favorite and they went on the road, but it was 2 time zones away and it's cold weather and they found a way to lose that game. And I hope my team doesn't fall into that trap. But I think it's something that you definitely keep an eye on because it's just human nature to wear down as the season goes on.
Yeah, definitely. Speaking of your team, we scheduled this so we could talk some Oregon and Ohio State. So let's start doing that. Big picture first. What do we know about this Ducks team as we reach the mid-November part or mid-October rather part of the calendar?
Man, it has been a unique year to say the least. Oregon came in with maybe the most hyped roster they have ever had. On paper, at least, maybe the best that they've ever put together. And they come out in week 1 against Idaho, and it's a dogfight in the second half. And then you get week 2 against Boise State, and it's like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Why is this like it happened again? And so there were a lot of folks that 2 weeks into the year, the sky's falling. Like, this team sucks. They're not going to do anything. Like, people just jumping off left and right. I wasn't quite there because the one primary issue that they had early in the season was their offensive line. And they had devastating injuries in training camp. So the way that it worked was they brought in a starting guard, Matthew Bedford from Indiana, who was supposed to be plug-and-play stud. He gets hurt in training camp. Okay, now you're down to starting guard. Now we slot in a backup guard there. Then the guy you slotted in to start for him, he got hurt in training camp as well. Okay, then the next backup offensive lineman, slide him in. He got hurt in camp as well. And so it became a thing of, do you want to have a freshman start at guard or a fifth-year walk-on? Is kind of the tough part with it of trying to figure out that combination on the offensive line. How's it going to fit together? In the second half of the Boise game, run the football more efficiently. The problem in that game was dumb turnovers. Once they could clean that up, there was a little optimism left in me of this can still be a very good team because I love what they are defensively. And now we've seen it 3 weeks in a row. The offensive line combo has settled down. Poncho, their new center, who has fit in perfectly, one of the highest graded guys in PFF this year. He's been awesome. They ran the ball efficiently against Michigan State last week, and that's not a terrible defense. So they've settled that down a little bit, but they've just been a unique team where they've kind of traded off. At times, the defense looks like the best in the country, and then they get shredded by Ashton Genty. At times, their offense can't be stopped, and then Dylan Gabriel throws 2 picks in the red zone. At times, they miss a PAT, and at times, they make a 50-yard field goal. It's like one of those, like, I know it's there. There's a combination there to be a good team, and I think the challenge this weekend, considering the opponent, is does all of that come together with the help of the home crowd? Because you're not going to get away with some of the stuff you've gotten away with early in the season.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that offensive line because you talk about the injuries, the concerns coming into the year. Last year, they led the country, 5 sacks allowed all season long. This year, first 2 games, it was 7 total, but none right in the last.
In the last 3 games, they haven't allowed a sack. Yep.
All right. So is that something where going into this one, have you totally closed the book on that being a concern, or is this kind of like that last test where if they pass this test, maybe they'll give up a sack or 2, but as long as it's not a crazy number, you're going to say, all right, they've got that problem fixed moving forward.
Yeah, it's still a concern for me. To me, it's one of the biggest storylines of the game. This is the best defensive line you're going to play all year. I don't even know if it's close. Ohio State's loaded across the board up front. We all know that. I love where you're at right now with the tackles. I think you have a stud young center who has filled that void perfectly. You're still weak at the guards. The guy that you brought in, Bedford, to be that guard, he got hurt again during their bye week when he was just about to make his return. So I was like, all right, yay, keep going with the backup guard. That'll be great. So it's definitely a concern because I don't know if you have the ability to beat Ohio State. If you don't have to run for 280 yards on them, but just to have something to keep them honest where every once in a while they got to bring a safety down. Every once in a while they got to be a little over aggressive. You can catch them and, maybe with a quick play action or an RPO. Like you have to be able to run the football in this game. And so I like where you're at center. I like where you're at tackles. But to me, it is a major question mark going into this weekend. Can you hold up against a defensive line that's that formidable? The best thing, though, at least that calms my nerves a little bit is early in the season, a lot of it with a walk-on center was communication stuff. Like they just weren't calling the right checks. They weren't picking up blitzing linebackers or blitzing corners. There were free rushers all over the place, to your point on the sack numbers. That was alarming. All of that has gotten cleaned up. So now it mostly comes down to just pound for pound, can you hang and can you get some push up front? I think the communication stuff is no longer a concern. So that makes me feel a little bit better, but definitely I think of the 2 or 3 biggest storylines in this game, how Oregon's offensive line plays is number 1 or number 2 on most people's list.
Is Dylan Gabriel, like where does he rank on the storylines of this game? Because I'll be honest, man, like he's obviously a good quarterback. Last year, 30 to 6 touchdown to interception ratio, goes to Oregon. I picked the Ducks to win the national championship before the season. And in some of those early games, like his numbers are great, right? 80% completion percentage, a couple touchdowns, no interceptions in those first 2. He has 11 versus 3 all year, and he's completing almost 80% of his passes. But I can't put my finger on, there's just something about him where I'm like, oh, did I make a mistake in picking the Ducks to win the national championship? You're kind of nodding your head. I wonder what you thought of him through 5 games.
There's definitely some of that. Now, here's the tough part with it, because I'm with you on the early numbers are misleading for him. Yeah. He had, I think it was the Boise game where he started like 11 for 11 for like 100 and something yards and 2 touchdowns. And you look up and they're losing and you're like, how is this? What is going on? Doesn't make sense. So I think a lot of it was cleaning up he's been much better the last couple of games. Now, the caveat to that is, he in the last 2 weeks has thrown 3 picks in the red zone.
Yep.
So they were driving late against UCLA. It was 28-3 with a minute to go in the first half. You're on the brink of making it 35-3, game over. Good night, everybody. And he threw basically a 100-yard pick six. Just a horrible decision. Last week, you're playing Michigan State. It should have been 35-0 at the half or 35-7. He throws 2 red zone picks. And it's just, what are we doing? So I guess this is a beauty in the eye of the beholder thing. He hadn't thrown a red zone pick in 2.5 years prior to the last 2 weeks. Now he's thrown 3 in the last 2 weeks. So is this a new trend that is going to be – because if he does that this weekend, Oregon will get dog walked. They don't have a chance to win the game if he's throwing picks in the end zone. So is it that, or is this a weird anomaly where he just, if something funky happened, he made a bad read and he'll clean it up because it wasn't an issue for him. There's no doubt offensively they're not at the level they were last year with Bo Nix. And it's funny, a lot of people in the Northwest kind of trash talk Bo. He's a check down Charlie. He doesn't throw the ball down the field, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of that. He also was an incredibly efficient quarterback that didn't turn the football over, that knew where his read was immediately, never took sacks, to your point again on that stat from the last 2 years. So it was such a high level that it's almost hard to live up to that bar. And I feel like it's just a slightly different team. So to spin it, I would say it's okay to have questions about that and the concerns about Gabriel. But the defensive side for Oregon is much better, I think, than they were last year. And so that's where it's almost like a balance of you're not quite where you were on this side, but you're a little bit better than you were on that side. So can you get to that level overall as a team? I think the one caveat I'll put on him this weekend, his ability to run the football to me is something they have not used. And this is true of both quarterbacks. But when you go back, when he beat Texas in the Red River, whatever they call it now, shootout, rivalry, whatever the name is, he had like 130 rushing yards, 120 rushing yards in that game. They just haven't run him a ton. I think part of that is opponent. We don't need to. That's something that I would keep an eye on with him. Use his legs throughout the course of this game.
Speaking of the running game, what do you think they ask for it from their backs this week?
Ranges a team of 150 yards, 4.5 yards per carry. I think you're happy if you can get there. I think Oregon has one of the more underrated backs in the country in Jordan James. It was funny. We were talking about this in August because Dante Dowdell transferred out to Nebraska, and he's a stud. That was a guy that I was like, man, I'm bummed that he's leaving. But it was primarily because he was number 3 or number 4 on the depth chart. So they're really talented at running back, and Jordan James will get the bulk of those carries this weekend. That was the biggest thing to see last week. They had been running the ball better, but they didn't have any explosive plays in the run game. It was a lot of 7 yards, 8 yards, 9 yards, 6 yards, 7 yards, and you were missing on those 25-yarders or 40-yarders. They finally had those last weekend, and the downfield blocking was elite for them. So I think that gave me a little more confidence going into this week, not comparing Ohio State's D-line to Michigan State's D-line. It's obviously different, but I think Jordan James has the ability to break a tackle, make a guy miss. If somebody's there in the hole, he can get around him, and he's an incredibly physical runner as well, catches the ball great out of the backfield. So I think he is a kind of underrated part of this game where a lot of attention will go to Ohio State's backs. Rightfully so. They're both great. I think Jordan James is right there with him and one of the more underrated backs in the country, and he should have a big game this weekend.
Speaking of those backs, you mentioned earlier a couple top 2 storylines in this one, how the Oregon offensive line holds up, and then obviously the run game for Ohio State versus the Oregon Ducks. And you go back to that Boise State game, and now it's like, it's funny because it's like, wow, they did a good job. They held Ashton Genty to just 7.7 yards per carry. It's like this weird outlier for him as he's having like one of the all-time seasons. In all seriousness, given what he has done since then, have you viewed that performance now through a different lens as it pertains to the season as a whole and to Saturday afternoon or Saturday evening rather?
I definitely have, man. I actually brought that up on Monday where people laughed, or not Monday, but the Monday after the Boise game. I mentioned like, dude, holding him to 190 wasn't bad, man. Like 100 of those yards came on 2 carries. And so one of those carries was Oregon's driving to take a 2-score lead and their tight end fumbles. Great. Let's shoot ourselves in the foot. Next carry, 70 yards to the house. Cool. From going up 14 to now we're tied in the 4th quarter. And then they fumbled on the next drive too. So just a wonderful sequence of events. So 70 came on that drive where he wasn't even supposed to be in the game and they fumbled. He comes on, quick change. Guy takes the wrong gap. Boom. He's gone to the house. The other chunk run, he had like a 40-yard run where I'm not kidding, dude. He broke 5 tackles behind the line of scrimmage. And Oregon's a good tackling team with NFL bodies up front. He's just shoving these guys like ragdolls. So I said it the Monday after that game of like, that's not bad. Because when you break down his carries, he had 25 carries. I think 13 of them, they held him below 3 yards on 13 of his 25 carries. And then it's explosive run, break a couple tackles. So that dude is an absolute monster. But if you're going to have a warm-up for a game like this, I'm glad that they faced him and that they got that experience because Junkins is great. Henderson's great. They're good backs. They're not an Ashton Genty, man. That guy's doing stuff we've never seen before. And if he gets to be able to play in second halves, he's going to break records this year, and he's a monster.
Yeah, he's awesome. What is a good day for the run defense versus Judkins and Henderson for the Ducks?
It's the biggest thing for me is winning on 1st and 2nd down. I am maybe on an island on this. Maybe people out there agree with me. I don't think Will Howard's that good. He can affect a game with his legs, sure. He doesn't scare me at all as a thrower of the football. Now, Jeremiah Smith one-handed catching things scares the hell out of me. But him as a court, like if you can get him in 3rd and 7s and cook up some pressure on him, I think that's where the recipe comes to win. So I think the biggest thing on stopping the run is just 1st and 2nd down, man. Like you're not going to shut him down. But don't let them fall forward for 7 yards every time on 1st down. Let them live with a free play on 2nd and 2 and then pick up a 1st down if they don't hit a shot down the field. That to me is absolutely key. But I think it's the most – and he is recruited at such a high level. They're deep. They're talented. They're athletic. They're multiple up front. This is unquestionably going to be the best defensive line that will have to overcome that. Jordan Birch is an NFL guy. Mateo Uiagalelei is an absolute stud, was a 5-star, who's coming into his own. Derek Harmon was one of the best D tackles in the Big Ten last year. He's now at Oregon. Jamari Caldwell is a transfer they brought in from Houston, who's a 320-pound guy. Like, they are loaded up front. And so I think they're ready for that challenge. And on that note, I wouldn't be surprised if this game ends up being a little bit more low scoring than so. I think the over-under is somewhere 52-53. Like, you tell me this is a 24-20 game, 27-21, somewhere in that range, I wouldn't be surprised at all.
You mentioned Will Howard at the beginning of that answer. I wanted to ask you about him because I'm with you. You know, I found it interesting that like the discourse last year, and rightfully so, was like, wow, they finally took a massive step back at quarterback with Kyle McCord out there. And it's like they're just not performing it the way that they used to. And then they go out and they get Will Howard. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. I mean, like you said, in theory, he can run the football. He hasn't had to this year. He only has 64 yards, as long as 19. And so, on the other hand, you're right. Like, they have Jeremiah Smith and they have Emeka Ibuka, which is just like bonkers because he would be a number 1 wide receiver for any other team. All of that to say, like, what can they do to him that really could change this game from a positive perspective for the Ducks?
Well, I think it's unique because Ohio State's offensive line coming into the year was their big question. If you talk to people out there, that was their concern. Now, they played great, but then it's the caveat of who the hell did they play? I mean, I was good defensively. I don't want to downgrade them, but that was a 7-0 game at halftime. And then they eventually wore them down because Cade McNamara couldn't stay on the field and the defense wore down in the second half. So I don't think you're going to have that equation, but when you watch Ohio State this year, a lot of times in the first half, it's just Marshall 14-10. Like, what's going on? Iowa 7-0. I know Michigan State game got kind of out of hand in the second quarter. They've gotten off to slow starts, and I think part of it is their offense just isn't clicking. Now, maybe him running the ball is a game changer. +1 run game, he dominates because he's a big body, and that could be an ultimate deciding factor in the game. But there's just an aspect of, I think, Oregon's ability to create pressure in which they're one of the top teams in the country in havoc rate and pass rush rate, win rate up front. Jordan Birch has just taken over games the last 2 weeks. Like, they have the ability to cook up pressures and make him uncomfortable. And I think you saw that last week where he's had a couple of games in a row under pressure where he's just thrown a like WTF interception. Not like I can fit a ball into a window, but more so like, oh God, here comes, panic and throw it. And you're like, what are you doing? Why would you throw that ball? He has a tendency to do that from time to time. So I'm sure they would say the same on the other side. The key to Oregon winning is making Will Howard beat you. If Jeremiah Smith's making one-handed catches and he's just lobbing it up, then you can't stop that because nobody can stop it. I can live with that result. But if you're going to have a chance to win this game, make him be the guy with his arm that beats you consistently in that environment with the pressure you can bring. And if he does that, you tip your cap to him and you say, hopefully we see you again in Indianapolis.
Are you expecting this to be the best atmosphere that you've ever seen at Autzen Stadium?
Sorry, you cut out there. I missed it for a quick. So what was the question?
Are you expecting this to be the best atmosphere you've ever seen at Autzen?
Yes. The only question I'll have on that is how much damn red shows up in the stadium. Like those freaking Buckeyes. There were rumors in the spring that they were buying season tickets and then selling the other home games just so they can guarantee. I know Husker fans have done that over the years. Like that's the fear. We were talking to somebody in Columbus this morning on the show, and he was in the airport, and he's like, yeah, there's a lot of red around here. We all got to flight to Portland. I'm like, oh, God, man. So that's my only fear is that there's a little bit more red in the stadium because I know their fan base travels well. But in terms of hype and anticipation, there's been some great ones. Oregon's been a premier program for 25 years now. This one will be near the top of the list, if not the top of the list. A lot of it will depend on how the game goes. If it turns out to be tight, Oregon wins, then obviously it will take the cake. If you lose, Ohio State pulls away, then maybe it'll be downgraded a bit for fans. But just in terms of the anticipation going in, there's maybe 2 or 3 games that fit this. They played USC when Pete Carroll was still there in 2009, when they were still humming. It was Chip's first year as head coach, and it was like a Halloween night, blackout, kind of similar to the vibes this weekend. They won that game. So that one's always near the top. And then in 2010, when they went to the title, they played Stanford later in the season with Harbaugh and Luck. They came to town undefeated, and they were down 21-0 in the first half. And then
right away,
like 40 unanswered points or something in one. So those are the two just in terms of build up and atmosphere that I would put up there. Oregon's won historically big games. Like 2003, they beat Michigan. The next week, they lost by 50 to Washington State. So Oregon fan gets pissed at me, but I'm like, yeah, that was great, but it downgraded it because your season tailspun after that. They beat Oklahoma on on a cheating onside kick in 2006. They got blown out by Cal the next week. So there have been great atmospheres. Those seasons derailed. But, yeah, this one is top 2 or 3, if not number 1 of all time in Autzen Stadium.
Yeah, it should be awesome. What do you think of the coaching matchup in this one, Dan Lanning versus Ryan Day?
They're almost identical, man. It's funny. Like we've joked all off season that Dan Lanning's kind of younger Ryan Day. They're the guy that when you say, what's the label nationally? Good coach, can't win the big game. Like that's the label about both of them. And it's ironic because one of them de facto has to win this weekend. And so it'll get some of that heat off their back until they probably lose later in the year. And then all that dumb chatter will be back. It's difficult to peg who has the advantage, man. Jim Knowles is a great defensive coordinator. Chip Kelly is still a good offensive mind. I don't doubt that. I also don't think he has the power and control of the sport that he did 10 years ago. And I think that was pretty evident of his time at UCLA. So he doesn't come in as one of these gurus that terrifies me as a fan anymore, maybe the way that he would have in that Impact a number of years ago. So this is a big one for both of them to kind of, sit on a fence on your answer, but it's huge. Like Dan Lanning's been unbelievable 2 years in. And I laugh off some of the criticism that he gets sometimes locally. I'll connect it to what you guys went through when you guys lost to Illinois on that Friday night game. I saw some of the online reaction to it, and I was just laughing. Like, Matt Rule has brought you to a point you haven't been. You're relevant for the first time in God knows how long. You haven't been to a bowl game since 2016. You got a true freshman quarterback. Like, yeah, he lost a close game, and you don't like those numbers, but you can clearly see the overall picture of the direction that you're going and be excited about that. And that's where I've been on Lanning. Like, he needs a big win. He needs a marquee win. I get it. If you told me the day that they hired him that this is where you were going to be 2 years in, that last year was going to be one of the best Oregon teams ever, you're competing for championships, you're recruiting at the highest level you ever have, like, you're not going anywhere. So eventually he's going to kick down one of these doors and win one of these games. A la, Harbaugh was that for years. Can't beat Ohio State. Then he did it 3 years in a row. Kirby can't beat Alabama. Then he beat him in a title game. Like, there's a lot of that with Lanning that he's eventually going to kick it down. I think pressure-wise, though, there's no question there's more on Ryan Day. Ryan Day, this is like title or bust for them, where Oregon's like, we'd love to get there. It'd be great if we got there. Ohio State's like, we need to win a championship this year. And if they lose this game, schedule's manageable. They'll still be in the mix later in the year. But those concerns and fears will come out of nowhere on Monday if they lose this game.
Yeah, it's funny you say what you did about the Illinois game, because we did a pod. Jack and I did, my co-host on the ID Club on Tuesday, titled "Why Are We Not Having More Fun?" And it was essentially like, this is what you've been begging for years. They're 5-1, and yet the discourse is not that of a 5-1 football team. Are Oregon fans having fun with the Dan Lanning era? Because I know, like, last year, the first loss to Washington, there were the fourth down decisions, which I loved in the moment, even if the result doesn't work out. The loss, honestly, in Vegas was the bigger surprise to me. I thought that they were going to win that one, and I thought they were going to win that one going away. Washington hadn't finished the regular season very strong, and so we know what happens there. And now it's like kind of like Ryan Day. It's a put up or shut up kind of year, but maybe with less vitriol, given they haven't lost to their rival for 3 years in a row. All that to say, like, what is the feeling with Dan Lanning in comparison to some of those other coaches that you guys have gotten to watch for the last 20 years?
Yeah, it's, I would say the vast majority of rational fans are thrilled, and they will be thrilled for another year or two. Like, the difference between Day and Lanning in this game is that Day's been a head coach, 6 or 7 years, and I know he had that success early, and now it's kind of hit not skids. They go 11-1 every year. We're acting like they're a dumpster of a program, but like he hasn't won a big game in 3 years, but he's won a playoff game. He's been to a national title. He's won a Big Ten. So he has those at least under his belt. If we're doing this, you're having me on in 3 years and we're talking about Dan Lanning going 10-2, 11-1, but they can't win the one big game on their schedule, or they can't win a playoff game. Eventually you become James Franklin, and that's just who you are, and you can't break through. I just think the 2-year thing is laughable to me, of how many big games has he even coached in? Because you want to count Georgia year one, game one. That's not a big game. No chance of winning that game, right? So then you go later in the year that he had 2 top 10 wins in his first season. Some fans want to say, oh, UCLA and Utah weren't that good. Utah won the Pac-12 that year, and they beat him with Bo on one leg. And then last year, to your point, the first Washington game, you're 2 yards away from ice in that game. You couldn't run it on 3rd and 2, couldn't get the last 4th down, and then your kicker misses a kick to tie it. You're there. It's one play that's the difference between winning or losing that game. The more alarming one, you're spot on, was Vegas, because they were a 10-point favorite in that game, fell down, found a way back. That was the head scratcher, I think, for a lot of folks. But I think most rational people look at it and say the program's in a great spot, man. Mario Cristobal could win a big game, and then he'd lose to 3-9 Stanford. Willie Taggart was only here for 1 year, so that was a cup of coffee. Mark Helfrich was a disaster. And so I think when you look at the last 10 years of where you've been at, this is as good as it's going to get. And I'm not raising it. They lose a close game on Saturday. It's a heartbreaker. You want to win it. Come Monday, hey, it's a long season, man. It's a 12-team playoff. You're still in the mix. You can still win the conference. Everything is still in front of you. But there's no doubt that for the small, maybe 15%, a win this weekend would at least shut them up for the short term.
For sure. If they do lose, I wonder how you view the rest of the schedule. We've mentioned the Purdue game. It is because it's about to be this hopscotch back and forth, kind of like what USC has been doing lately, right? Where it's Friday night at Purdue, and they're a dumpster fire. But I've seen good teams go into that house of horrors, weirdly, and lose games. Back home for Illinois, at the Big House, back at home for Maryland, at Wisconsin. And so it's and then back at home for the matchup versus Seattle after an off week. I didn't really name a whole lot of good teams in there, but the travel of the back and forth, I just wonder if that's going to get them.
It could. And I think that goes back to where we started. We're talking about that travel. Does that end up having an impact? And you have a hangover game. Hell, watching Alabama lose to Vanderbilt, I've already circled next week, dude. If you win this weekend, I am not skating in free and easy to Friday night. Purdue sucks. Oregon State waxed them a couple of weeks ago. That's a bad football team. But, Vanderbilt's respectable. I should give them a little. They have no business beating Alabama. So hangovers are a real thing. I think that's where we'll ultimately judge where this season goes, right? If you lose a close game, they did last year to Washington early in the year, and then they rebounded, and they basically blew everybody out on their schedule the rest of the way. There was not one close game in the fourth quarter the rest of their season, which is why everybody loved them to beat Washington in the rematch, because Washington did the opposite. They won, and then they should have lost 6 games after that, but they kept finding ways to win them. And Kalen DeBoer, finally the chickens finally came home to roost for him for losing to Vanderbilt, because he should have lost to Arizona State, Stanford, Utah, Washington State, Oregon State, USC, and Utah the rest of the way after that. But I digress. It's an easier schedule, but as we know in college football, man, you hate to take on the coach speak, but sometimes you do. It's you got to bring it every week. You got to have, we're playing ourselves, and we got to bring because if you don't, crazy things can happen. And so it's manageable. They should win all those games. Will they? Who the hell knows? The travel could be an impact on that.
Hey, what did you think of the Kalen DeBoer discourse this week down in Tuscaloosa?
I loved it, man. I loved every second of it. That guy, look, He's a brilliant coach. Nobody doubts that. Brilliant offensive mind. He also inherited, I think people forget how talented and how good Washington's program was because they had one bad year with Jimmy Lake where everything flew into the side of the mountain, but they were recruiting at such a high level. And when you looked at, this was the argument I made all last year for Lanning or DeBoer, 85% basically of Lanning's roster in year 2 were guys that he brought in. He had flipped the entire thing over. By the time DeBoer was in year 2, he still had 70% of that roster was there before he got there. Now, he brought in Penix, and they don't do what they do without Penix. So I'm not trying to, throw him completely under a bus, but he won a lot with guys that he inherited. They had a recruiting class. They were undefeated. They had a recruiting class outside the top 25 at the end of the year last year. So that program was going to regress either way because you just can't replace that level of talent. They nearly broke the conference record for most NFL draft picks. Like, that was a ready-made situation that we just didn't quite see because Jimmy Lake was such a bad coach. And he got away with this last year, man. It drove me nuts, honestly, not just because they're rivals and I hate that school. Like, they didn't score an offensive touchdown against Arizona State last year, the week after beating Oregon. And that, I was ripping my TV off of a wall. Arizona State was one of the worst teams in the country last year. They couldn't score a touchdown at home against them, and they got a 100-yard pick six to win. They played Stanford. Stanford dropped an easy completion on 4th down that would have gave them a great chance to win. Oregon State snapped the ball over the punter's head in the end zone. They win by 2. It's like all these little things. Like, how does he? It's like the Jesse GIF from Breaking Bad.
Getting away with it.
At some point, it's got to bite him in the ass. And so that was. I jokingly said the Monday after the Alabama-Georgia game, watch him be in a dogfight with Vanderbilt this weekend because this is who he is as a coach. Big games, big moment. His team's ready to go. And these kind of random games against South Florida earlier this year, you're like, what? How is that a close? So I'm curious to see how it goes the rest of the way, but it's been funny to see fans in Alabama with their hair on fire. And he's tucking his shirt in. They're all losing their minds. Like, of all the programs this could happen to, they deserve this, man. They got to run with Nick Saban. And if you can't rationally respond to that of like, we're going to regress a little bit and it's never going to be the same, shame on you, dude. Kalen Moore, look, he's a good coach. I jokingly mentioned all these games he eked out. He did get lucky last year to go 12-0. But this idea that we got to run him out of town after losing one game is just – it's perfect. And it's why a lot of people in the offseason were like, I don't want that job because that's going to be you lose one game, that's the reaction. You cannot lose to Vanderbilt, and he broke the cardinal sin.
Hey, one more kind of along these lines, and we'll get your pick and get you out of here. Dan Lanning was one of the first names mentioned, right, when that job came open back in January. I was listening to a pod earlier this week, and one of the hosts was theorizing that Dan Lanning doesn't want to be the guy that follows the guy, but he'd be comfortable following the guy that follows the guy that follows the guy. I wonder, is that something that you think we'll be keeping an eye on? I mean, not that DeBoer is going to fall on his face, but I mean, Alabama fans aren't happy to go 10-2 or 9-3. And so I wonder what happens in the next couple of years if that were to happen for him. Is that a concern, do you think, long-term?
Look, you never say never because it's college coaches and they lie out of their side of their mouth every time they open it about leaving for jobs. And I'm never going to – Mario Cristobal took the job at Oregon and said, you have to drag me out of this building. And then 3 years later, he's like, I'm not going to game plan for Utah because I'm negotiating my contract with Miami right now. So you always take this stuff with a grain of salt. The DeBoer stuff, I don't see him getting fired. My take on him has been he's going to be there for a year or two and then bolt to the NFL. Yeah. Guy hates recruiting. He doesn't you don't want to do all that crap. Good offensive mind. Go coach the NFL. He'd be a great fit there, and I would hire him probably at that level. Look, save this for a year from now when he leaves for Alabama. Like, I don't have that fear. I just don't. Like, he genuinely seems different. He has bought up huge pieces. He bought a mansion in Eugene and then subsequently bought like multiple houses around him. So basically, he has like a major compound where he hosts all this stuff for players. He has talked about his loyalty to Oregon in terms of they gave him the opportunity. He feels like he has everything that he needs to win. And I would hope at least, and this is the argument that I would make, is that a lot of these coaches, you go take one of those jobs. Like if he wins this weekend, he is a hero. If he ever gets Oregon to a title game or wins a title, God forbid, like, man, they're going to build a statue for that guy. He is the greatest coach in the history of the program. You go somewhere else, you lose 2 games, and immediately it's like, this guy's not the guy. He's a bum. Jonathan Smith's going through this right now in Michigan State. Like, they suck this year. We all knew they would. If he's struggling at Oregon State, they're not running him out of town in Corvallis. He's a legend there. So I truly believe when he came out with the stuff this offseason of this is where I want to be and I'm never going to leave, like, I genuinely believe him. I might be dumb. I might be drinking Kool-Aid, and I'm going to die with the rest of us at the end, it's poison Kool-Aid. But right now, I genuinely believe him. And so I don't think last year was about him. The game that I'll use as the analogy is the Alabama-Georgia game. I think Georgia's better than Alabama. Yeah. If they played again, I would take Georgia to win the game. I think the second half showed that when they came back and they just They got hit with a sledgehammer early in that game. Crazy atmosphere, a little rattled. I think they're the better team. I think Ohio State's a better team. There's not doubt in my mind that Ohio State's the better team. I just think there's something special about playing these games at home. And we can make fun of Lanning for not beating Washington last year. That game was in Seattle in one of the craziest atmospheres of the season. You get this game at Autzen Stadium with that crowd. And to me, if you get off to a good start and you can make Ohio State, who has been slow in first halves, try and play catch up and play from behind and kind of build that pressure of like, oh, we can't just coast to another win like we have the first 5 weeks. I think you got a good shot at winning. Wouldn't be surprised. It's a coin flip game, right? Either way. But because of the home crowd and everything that's built into this week, I'll say 31-27 Ducks.
Awesome. Hey, how's your Nebraska family feeling about the 5-1 start? For those who don't know, Andy has some family back here that I learned don't like me on my radio show. How are they feeling about year 2 of the Matt Rule era?
Dude, they're feeling great, man. They're loving every second of it. They have been waiting for something positive to happen for so long. The schedule's manageable. You got little Patrick Mahomes, which, by the way, little uncomfortable watching it. It's a little awkward. It's a little over the top, but a great kid. I'm rooting like hell for him. They're loving it, dude. Like I'm so happy for people out there that just have been. It's such a good football town. Such passionate fans. They've deserved better for 15 years. You guys all have. And so when Matt Rule was hired, I said he's the right guy. They're going to turn this thing around. It just defensively, you'll see it right away. You did last year. Now you just need to get the offense answered. Like Raiola's going to have moments. He's going to have bad picks or bad plays, and it's just you take your lumps with it. But the fears that I had about them, and I remember talking to family about this, we've seen freshman quarterbacks really struggle and then immediately be like, all right, I'm out of here. Dante Moore's in Oregon now. He started last year at UCLA, one of the top in the country. It's a dumpster fire for him last year, and he got the hell out of there. Rashada at Arizona State did the same thing. So we've seen a lot of these guys struggle early and then transfer. The fact that you're winning and they're kind of putting him in a good position to succeed, dude, that program is back. Not back to competing for conference championships or winning national titles, but back to being relevant. And that was always the first step. Now you're seeing recruiting pick up. Like they're heading in the right direction. Rule was such a good coach. They're all pumped, man. They're loving every second of it.
Well, I am certainly looking forward to the next time that Nebraska and Oregon play, and that one is 2 years from now up in Autzen Stadium. So maybe we'll be traveling up and hanging out again. He's Andy Johnson, one of the hosts of Dirt and Sprague on 1080 The Fan. Also will be involved on Saturday afternoon for the pregame coverage for the Ducks and the Buckeyes. Really excited for this football game. It should be a spectacular one as we all are watching it around the country. Andy, man, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us on the I-80 Club today. We really appreciate it.
You got it, man. Hopefully the internet connection wasn't too bad to edit around. Hopefully that's not too much of a pain in the butt. But love talking the game, man. Thanks as always. Appreciate it, man.
Continue to like and subscribe to the I-80 Club on YouTube. And if you would like more content, including stuff that we keep paywalled only, you can hit up patreon.com/I-80 Club. Jack and I will be back next week for a few pods. We will talk to you then.